If you're anything like me and you really like shooting your 10 gauge, but factory ammo can be kind of hard to find, and when you do find it, it's pretty expensive, and you need a cheap way to reload your shells, well, here's your solution. This is just a standard 12 gauge Reload All 2 conversion kit from Amazon. It's like $25. It's completely unmodified except for the final crimp tube. I took a Dremel and I opened it up just a little bit for 10 gauge. I also cut off ½ inch off the final crimp tube just because you can load 2.5 inch shells that way. I'll get into that. That shell you see in the back right here, that's a 3-inch 10 gauge shell. I had a factory shell that the crimp had kind of started losing its life on me, so I cut it off and it's good to go. A Dremel is the only tool you'll need to open up that final crimp tube. I actually don't have the bit I did it with, but it's just a sanding bit. It's best to run it on 3 and below because, well, that plastic can get really hot and start to melt, and if that hits you in the face, it kinda hurts. I know from experience. In order to resize your brass, you're going to need a mech resizing ring, 10 gauge of course, and a piece of PVC pipe. And how that works is you just set your resizing ring onto your shell, and then the PVC pipe goes over the resizing ring. If you don't have the PVC pipe, then your press can't push the resizing ring down far enough to resize your brass. You will have to take a screwdriver or something and punch out the primer by hand. You'll just set the empty shell onto the resizing ring. That way it's sitting off a flat surface, and just punch it out with a mallet and a screwdriver. It's really easy to do by hand. The press, the primer punch is not long enough to reach it. Now as for the wad guide, you have two options here. One, the better option, is just to drill another hole 1/2 inch above the existing screw hole. The easier option is to take the wad guide itself and just drill another hole at the bottom of it. However, the problem with that is this plastic is very thin, and over time that screw it can become loose, and you might end up having to replace your wad guide. They're very cheap though. 10 gauge wads will go through the 12 gauge wad guide just fine. They're a little bit tight, however it will work just fine. I also took the Dremel to the 12 gauge shell holder that came with the conversion kit in order for it to fit the 10 gauge shells. You'll probably have to excuse this awkward camera angle. Sadly, I don't have 3 hands and I need both my hands to manipulate the press. This is a once fired Federal. I have it loaded with number 4 buck. Hopefully you can see that. The pre-crimp tube on the 12 gauge press will crimp 10 gauge shells perfectly. And here's the final crimp. It's not perfect, but it's a 12 gauge press. Was supposed to be anyway. And for $25, considering the fact that you may or may not have the press itself already, that's a great deal. Right, this time, hopefully it's a bit better of a camera angle. I have a never fired, primed Federal hull, recovered flight control wad, and this time it's double up buck instead of number 4 buck. Again, pre-crimp tube. Here's how they come out looking. And here's the final crimp. Never fired hole. I can actually probably get it looking a bit better than that. Yeah, a little bit. again. This was 25 bucks. The lead load all press, you can load anything technically, in my experience, from 10 gauge all the way down to 28 gauge. I have the kits for, 10 gauge now, 12 gauge, 16, and 20. You can load 28 gauge on the 20 gauge press by just, using the press as normal, and then after you final crimp it, the case mouth will have a slight bell to it. Just take a socket, like from a socket set, and literally you just round the case mouth back out and they look almost factory. The Leload All 2 is an extremely versatile press. You are, like I said, able to crimp anything from 2.5 inch shells all the way up to 3.5 inch shells by simply cutting off 1/2 inch of the final crimp tube. Some old 10 gauge guns only have 2 7/8 inch chambers, and if you're like me, roll crimping isn't the best solution to getting shorter holes, because you can't reload those as much as you can a full crimp. These Federal holes, some of them, I'm not kidding, I have loaded probably 10 times or more, and they still load up great. This one just happened to, it died on me, so I cut it off. These are 16 gauge shells. The two green ones in the middle are 2.5 inch shells, and the two blue ones are, those are 2 3/4, just standard length. This is that 28 gauge I was talking about. I crimped it on the 20 gauge press, and to fix the bell in the case mouth, I just took a socket and I rounded it back out. Really simple to do. That crimp looks really good to me. The shell has been reloaded a few times. That one is actually black powder. I have a really old 28 gauge single shot as well as a semi-automatic that I like to shoot black powder through the single shot. It is rated for modern smokeless powder though. Black powder is just fun. And just as a weird side note, I do also load 24 and 32 gauge. I don't currently have a 24 gauge shotgun, but I do have a chamber insert that fits inside a 16 gauge barrel, so I've been shooting 24 gauge shells out of it. Now the 32 gauge, it's an H&R. I have two 32 gauges. The first one I have is an H&R with a rifled barrel. It's technically a tranquilizer gun, but I'll make my own slugs for it and use it as a slug gun. The other one I have a video of it up on my channel. It's the previous video to this one right here. It's a really old Stevens single shot. It's a smoothbore barrel, and for it, I just fired birdshot and buckshot out of it. It shoots a 1/2 ounce load, but you can load them up to 11/16 ounce, I think. The 1/2 ounce load is 1350 to 1400 FPS, which is quite a bit better than a 410. I'll also load 410 too. Well, thanks for watching the video. Hopefully I gave you some good information. Just a cheap way to get a 10 gauge loader. Thank you for watching.